All right, we're looking at collecting and analyzing data for the case study report this week. Let's just do a quick run through about what that might look like for your work in the coming days. All right, just a few reminders. We've set next Wednesday, April 27th, as the last day really to collect data for the case study report. If you need to bleed into Thursday, that's okay. Wednesday would then give you a full week to put together the data. Don't forget to, as well, the school requires you to complete a log of your clinical hours for this course. You'll find at the back of the syllabus, and again, clinical hours include giving the tests, they include analyzing the data, all of the work that you do inside your school to complete the assessments count. So we need 25 hours, and you should log those into the log, scan it, and then email it to me by May 3rd. Finally, your reading assignment this week in the QRI, if you haven't done so already, is pages 86 through 89. That's chapter 12. It's about recording the data. And then pages 54 through 85 detail how to give the specific assessments. You do not have to read the entire 31 pages, but do read the parts that talk about your particular assessment. So if you have the Think Aloud piece, you'll want to read those pages specifically around Think Aloud, etc., etc. So I want to talk a bit about putting the findings section together as well as the analysis section together. In other words, I want you to be thinking about once you've administered the assessment, what it is you're doing with it. Let me give you two options for the findings section. Again, in the findings section, the way we're doing it in this course is you're reporting the data. There's no editorializing, there's no conclusions, it's just this is what happened. And there's two ways really to do that. One is you're likely using the student profile sheet, that chart that QRI provides on page 87, I believe it is, and the forms themselves at the back. So if you've given the assessments, you know that there's, for each assessment, depending on what it's used for, there might be a recall, there might be a look back, there might be a form to fill out that miscue analysis. So that's where you're collecting the data when you administer the assessments. And if you're observing the students, say in a running record, etc., you're probably also taking what we would call field notes. You're just jotting down notes that you observe. So given that, there's a couple of different ways to go about this. One is to look at each of your assessments and go through and summarize your findings, your understanding from what you read. We typically call this memoing, and by that, what I mean is put together an initial paragraph for each assessment, for each collection of data that you have, outlining the main ideas, stating the main pieces of data that emerge. So you'll want to say, this is, if it matters, this is how many words per minute the student read, this is do the error analysis or identify how many they got correct, etc. So this is your opportunity really just to write a quick summary of what the findings were from each assessment. Another way to organize your findings is to pose and answer questions based on the assessment type. In other words, the motivation assessment is essentially an answer to the question, how motivated to read is your child? So use the assessments and then the questions that the QRI poses itself. So if you look at pages 88 through 89 and 96 through 97, you'll see there's literally questions to be answered by the QRI. And you can take those questions and you can go through and even across assessments and say, this is what the data is that I have to answer each question. So if your question is, what is the motivation level of the child? You could go through and say, this is what the child scored on self-concept. This is what they said in the interview in order, what is it that gives you an answer to that question? So again, two ways here. You're really just sort of taking your data, which is in numerical form and possibly in notes, and putting it in further written form, either in the form of writing what we would call a memo or a summary of each data piece that you have, or by asking and answering questions that you have based on the assessment type. And if you choose the latter approach, again, look at the QRI because it lays out some of those questions for you already, and those questions might be relevant and align with your purpose for the assessment. Now I want to talk about the analysis piece. This is going to be the critical piece of the report. And I'm going to give you two ways of doing it. Neither way is going to blow your mind here as being something new. This is really about deductive versus inductive reasoning. So let's talk a bit about both those ways. One is around questions and one is around claims. So we're going to do the inductive first and then the deductive approach second. So on the week 11 folder on the site, I've posted some example charts, but typically this is what researchers and data scientists do. They take evidence that they have and make data tables out of it and then use that to help draw conclusions. So if you want to take a question-oriented approach, this is going to be the approach you take when you're not sure what the data is telling you, or you're taking a particularly open stance, and you're trying to figure out what you can sort of suss out or shake out from the data. A question-oriented analysis would mean posing questions that you're trying to answer, and then looking to see what evidence you have to support it. And from that, then you actually generate a hypothesis or an answer that could then actually form your analysis. So one example is, what is the true instructional level of the learner? If you're coming into looking at the data not knowing it, and that's the key piece here is, and we'll get to this in a second here with the claims thing, you would use questions if you're actually not sure or you're trying to find out something. If you're more certain about something, you want to use a claims-oriented approach. But in this case, we're asking this question, what is the true instructional level of the learner? And then we're looking at the data sources that we have and seeing, well, what evidence is in support of it. And you can see here, I think it's critical that you have at least 2 sources of evidence for each question you ask. That way you can draw upon multiple pieces of evidence from multiple sources to do what I call triangulation, which is to confirm your suspicions. So you can see here what I've done in this example is I've posed a question, I've gathered some data that seems relevant to answering the question, and then from looking at that data, I've posed a hypothesis based on that that's now can be supported by evidence. This differs from a claim-oriented analysis, and in a claim case, you're going to walk in and say, I have a theory, right? I have a claim, if you want, an argument to be made for the particular learner coming into the analysis of the data. And if that's the case, you're going to want to prove the claim. That's the key piece here. So you can see in the left-hand column, I've identified a particular aspect of the learner's profile, in this case their low self-concept of her reading skills, and I've sort of said that this has an effect on her reading. And you can see here then, with that claim, I went to go look in the evidence I had that supports that claim. And again, you see from multiple pieces of evidence here. Here I grabbed 3 again. And then the other key piece when you're doing claim-oriented analysis is really to sort of check yourself and allow for possible refuting or challenging evidence. So you can see in this 3rd column, it doesn't mean you're wrong if there are some things that contradict or push back on the data. That's actually in some ways good because it helps you call into question and think more deeply about what it is that is true and isn't true. So you can see here I also added that data as well, just to sort of shape out what I understand, because it might tell me something about the learner's profile as well. So you see here again, this claims piece is all starting from this idea that I feel like I have an answer going into the analysis. Whereas the question piece is I don't have an answer, I don't know, I'm looking at the data to hopefully tell me something. So I think you're going to have to sort of feel out where you feel you're at going in once you've collected the data and you've taken a look at it, whether or not you feel like you're in position or like ready or know what you think you know from this. But if you don't, a question-oriented approach makes sense. All right, next steps. We're going to have conferences later next week. That by that point you'll have analyzed the data and you'll be ready to head towards the rough draft. We'll do a quick conference later next week to discuss your findings. We'll talk about that early next week. Note that the instructions about the format for the case study, as well as the rubric that I'll be using, are now in the week 12 folder. The draft is due on May 2nd. I'll talk more about the rubric and the reporting next week, but definitely take a look at it because it lays out what I'm giving points to, how it's organized around the standards, etc. And my plan right now is to have us do one last group discussion on April 28th. That way everyone will have given the assessments so we can talk a bit about making sense of them. Okay.